When you enter into a relationship with a narcissist, one of the most disturbing realizations, often made too late, is that you are never truly seen, not as a full person, not as a distinct and sovereign individual. You were assessed, categorized, and assigned a role. That role was not based on who you are in any holistic or nuanced sense, but rather on what you could provide to support the narcissist's fragile internal narrative. That's the brutal truth. To a narcissist, you are not encountered as a subject, you are used as an object. This is psychologically significant. It speaks to a fundamental failure of what Martin Buber called the I-thou relationship, the human ability to encounter another not as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. The narcissist can't do that. Their psychological structure is built around defense, not connection. They relate to others as instruments of reflection. In their mind, you are a mirror, not a person. A mirror designed to validate their grandiosity, their superiority, or their victimhood, depending on the type. You exist to admire, to absorb blame, to conform, and above all, to never threaten the image they are so desperately trying to protect. Now, this image is key. The narcissist is not merely selfish in the everyday sense. They are perpetually engaged in a subconscious project to avoid psychological collapse. Their self-worth is brittle. It lacks the internal scaffolding of earned confidence, moral responsibility, or real self-awareness. So they outsource their self-esteem to others, and that's where you come in. You were cast as the caretaker, the admirer, the scapegoat, whatever served the moment. But these are roles, they're not relationships. And once you begin to deviate from the role, if you begin asserting boundaries, expressing needs, or evolving in a way that makes you less controllable, the narcissist doesn't try to understand. They don't adjust. They simply switch tactics. They might devalue you. They might discard you, but it's all part of the same underlying mechanism. You are no longer useful to the illusion they must maintain. That's the point. Your value to them is contingent upon your compliance with their internal script. We see this everywhere. In romantic partnerships, where the moment you stop tolerating mistreatment, you're labeled too difficult. In families, where the child who dares to challenge the narcissistic parent's version of events is smeared or ostracized. In workplaces where the competent employee becomes a threat to the narcissist in charge, and so they are undermined, gaslit, or erased. This is not interpersonal conflict in the normal sense. This is psychological objectification. You were never allowed to exist outside the narcissist's frame. Now, you might ask, do they know they're doing this? And the answer is complicated. On a conscious level, perhaps not always. But on a deeper psychological level, yes. There is an awareness, however suppressed, that they are extracting more than they give. That they are not engaging with you as an equal, but as a utility. And this is where the cruelty lies. You could pour yourself out for them and they would still see you as replaceable. Because what they're connecting to isn't you, it's what you provide. Validation, praise, obedience, emotional labor. If you stop delivering those, your humanity becomes inconvenient. And yet, paradoxically, they often accuse you of being selfish, cold, or ungrateful. That's projection. What they secretly think but will never admit is that they feel entitled to your devotion regardless of how they treat you. That entitlement is baked into the interaction. And when you withdraw that devotion, when you wake up to the manipulation, they feel betrayed, not because they love you, but because you stopped playing the role. You're not allowed to change the script. Only they can do that. So when people say the narcissist never really loved you, it's not just a cliche, it's a tragic insight. They didn't love you, they loved the function you served. They were never connecting with your soul, your dreams, your dignity. They were connecting with their alone need to be admired, obeyed, and unchallenged. And the most painful part? You may have spent months, years, even decades believing that your worth was tied to how well you played that role. But that was never love. That was a transaction disguised as intimacy. What's profoundly paradoxical about narcissistic relationships is this. The very qualities that draw the narcissist to you in the first place, the traits they seem to admire and praise, are often the same ones that eventually provoke their resentment. Your strength, your emotional intelligence, your independence, your empathy. These are magnetic to the narcissist, not because they want to nurture them, but because they want to own them. You represent something they lack, and in their psychological framework, anything they lack must either be conquered or destroyed. There is no in-between. In the beginning, they will idealize you. That's the classic stage. You're seen as brilliant, beautiful, capable, intuitive, everything they've ever wanted. But if you watch closely, this admiration isn't rooted in deep understanding. It's rooted in projection. They're not responding to who you truly are. They're reacting to an image, a fantasy, a curated version of you that fits neatly into their narrative. And as long as you don't disrupt that illusion, things seem to go well. But inevitably, something shifts. Maybe you start expressing needs. Maybe you succeed in a way they didn't anticipate. Maybe you stand up to something manipulative. In that moment, your strength stops being an asset in their eyes. It becomes a threat. And now, they have a problem. They still want the benefit of your presence, but they also feel undermined by your autonomy. So what do? They begin to chip away, subtly at first, through sarcasm, passive aggression, backhanded compliments, then more overtly through gaslighting, control tactics, and emotional withdrawal. Psychologically, this is driven by what you could call narcissistic fragility. They are acutely aware, though not always consciously, that they cannot match the depth or resilience that you bring into the relationship. Rather than be inspired to grow or rise to your level, they feel diminished by the comparison, and here's the kicker, they will blame you for that feeling. You'll be told you're too much, or too intense, or too emotional, or too independent. But what's actually happening is that your existence is exposing their inadequacy. And that is intolerable. Now, let's explore the deeper philosophical layer of this dynamic. Strength in its highest form is not brute force or domination. It is integrity. It is the capacity to carry the weight of life with grace. It is the ability to discern truth from illusion and to live accordingly. When you bring that kind of strength into a relationship with a narcissist, you're not just threatening their ego. You're threatening their entire worldview because their reality depends on deception, self-deception, interpersonal deception, emotional manipulation. And you, with your clarity and your empathy, disrupt that system. Empathy, in particular, is a dangerous thing in the eyes of the narcissist because real empathy sees through, it perceives incongruence, it questions falsehoods, it asks why and to what end. That kind of scrutiny is unbearable for someone who survives by impression management. So instead of engaging in reciprocal vulnerability, they attack, they deflect, they twist your insight into accusation and turn your concern into control, all in the service of self-protection. It's not that they don't see your strength, it's that they can't allow you to keep it, not without consequence. If they can't possess it, they must erode it. And this is why so many people who've survived narcissistic relationships describe feeling confused, diminished, even broken, because their strength wasn't merely ignored, it was weaponized against them. They were made to feel guilty for being whole. This dynamic is deeply tragic because it means that the narcissist often destroys the very thing they were initially drawn to. They sabotage the connection that could have healed something in them, not because they're evil, but because they're unequipped to handle the vulnerability it requires. They don't know how to coexist with someone who doesn't orbit around their needs. And so your strength becomes the justification for their abuse. They resent it because it reminds them of their own emptiness. And that ultimately is what they're running from. Not you, but their own inadequacy reflected in your competence. So, what does this mean for you, the person caught in the crossfire of this contradictory attention? It means you have to understand the difference between being valued and being used. You have to stop mistaking admiration for love when that admiration is rooted in control. And most importantly, you have to recognize that your strength is not the problem. It is the threat to their illusion and therefore the clearest sign that you were never the weak one in the story. One of the more insidious truths about narcissistic psychology, and this is something people often struggle to accept, is that the narcissist secretly views your emotional pain not just as tolerable, but as useful. Let me say that again, because it's a hard pill to swallow. They often perceive your suffering as a form of currency, a signal of their power, or even a source of satisfaction. Now, they're unlikely to ever admit this, not to you and certainly not to themselves, but if you look closely, not at what they say, but at what they do, the pattern is unmistakable. And this is just a matter of being callous or indifferent. It goes deeper than that. In the narcissist's internal world, emotional dominance is central. They're not seeking harmony, understanding, or mutual growth. Those concepts require reciprocity. And they don't operate in a world of equals. They operate in a hierarchy, one where they must remain on top. So, what happens when you express hurt, when you break down, when you say what you did really hurt me? In a healthy dynamic, that moment would prompt reflection or empathy. But in a narcissistic framework, it often triggers a very different reaction, a sense of victory. Here's why. Your emotional pain signals to them that they have influence, that they've managed to provoke a response, and in the twisted logic of narcissistic validation, any emotional reaction, even one born out of anguish, is a form of attention. This is something most people don't grasp until they're well into the relationship, or often until it's over. You think you're showing vulnerability, opening the door to connection. But in the narcissist calculus, you're showing weakness. And weakness in their eyes is not something to comfort, it's something to exploit. This becomes particularly evident during what we might call the devaluation phase. It's the stage in the narcissistic cycle where the initial idealization fades and they begin to erode your confidence. Often your attempts to communicate, those honest, raw expressions of feeling, are used against you. You might be mocked for being too sensitive or accused of playing the victim. Sometimes they'll even twist your pain into an indictment of your character. This is why no one puts up with you, they might say. Or, you're always creating drama. In those moments, they're not misunderstanding you, they're managing, weaponize, your emotions to maintain control. Psychologically speaking, this isn't just cruelty for its own sake, it's a kind of self-preservation. The narcissist's own emotional world is often a minefield of shame, inadequacy, and unresolved trauma. So when your pain surfaces, it becomes intolerable for them to acknowledge it as real and valid, because that would require self-reflection. And that's dangerous terrain. It would mean confronting their own capacity to hurt others, to fail morally, to be less than the grandiose self-image they cling to. So instead, they reframe the narrative. You're the problem. You're unstable. You're making too much out of nothing. That reversal of accountability is how they maintain their psychological armor. This is why so many survivors of narcissistic abuse walk away from the relationship not just hurt, but deeply confused. Because your instincts told you that your emotions should matter, that if someone truly cared, they would want to make things right, and yet the narcissist seemed almost invigorated by your pain. Not always overtly, sometimes it's subtle, a smirk when you're crying, silence when you need comfort, or a cold indifference that cuts deeper than any scream ever could. Other times, it's more direct, using your vulnerabilities as ammunition in later arguments, or bringing up your emotional reactions in front of others to humiliate you. And this isn't accidental, it's strategic. They learn your weak spots early on, what makes you tick, what makes you cry, what makes you feel ashamed. Then, over time, they test those vulnerabilities. They push the boundaries, not to break you all at once, but to see how much control they can exert. It's a slow erosion. And because it's gradual, you begin to question yourself long before you question them. But here's the most important point. This is not love. This is not even conflict. This is emotional sadism, often cloaked in the language of intimacy. And until you recognize that dynamic, until you're willing to see it clearly, you remain vulnerable to it. You'll keep trying to speak to someone who doesn't want to hear you. You'll keep trying to heal with someone who benefits from your wounds staying open. What often goes unnoticed, but lies at the heart of the narcissist's internal experience, is their quiet, constant envy. Not the kind of envy we associate with fleeting comparisons, someone else's car, career, or good fortune, but a deeper, more existential kind. The narcissist is not merely envious of what you have, they are envious of who you are. Your emotional richness, your authenticity, your capacity for connection. These are things they cannot fabricate, cannot steal, and cannot replicate, and that to them is infuriating. Now, you must understand something crucial here. Envy in the narcissistic psyche is not a passing feeling. It is a structure. It is a lens through which they view the world, especially the people closest to them. Anyone who possesses something they lack becomes not a person to admire or learn from, but a threat that must be diminished. And this is where the pathology reveals itself. While a healthy person might feel inspired by another's light, the narcissist interprets that same light as a personal affront. You might notice this play out in subtle, even paradoxical ways. Perhaps you've shared a joyful moment, maybe a professional win or a moment of personal clarity, and instead of celebration, you're met with silence or deflection or even an underhanded jab. It seems confusing at first. Why wouldn't someone who says they care about you feel happy for you? But this is the secret. Many people don't realize. The narcissist resents your joy because it reminds them of their emptiness. Your fulfillment punctures the false self they've worked so hard to construct. This false self, the grandiose mask they wear, is not built on stable foundations. It is held together by comparisons, illusions of superiority, and constant validation. But when you come into the room with genuine substance, when you're grounded in something real, something earned, they are internally destabilized. They feel it as a kind of psychic exposure. And instead of facing their own deficiencies, they try to pull you down to relieve their inner torment. Envy, in this context, becomes active. It's not just a feeling, it's a motive. It drives behaviors, subtle sabotage, dismissive comments, unsolicited critiques, or even outright betrayal. It's not always loud, and that's what makes it dangerous. Sometimes it's just the absence of support when you needed it most. Sometimes it's minimizing your pain or mocking your ambitions under the guise of just being honest. These are not random behaviors. They're targeted responses to the threat of your wholeness. There's also a deeper philosophical point here that's worth exploring. Envy, unlike anger or sadness, is rarely admitted, even to the self. Most people don't want to acknowledge envy because it suggests inadequacy. And for the narcissist, admitting inadequacy is unthinkable. So the envy must be externalized, projected. They begin to view you as arrogant or selfish or undeserving. This mental gymnastics allows them to preserve the fantasy that they are still the superior one, that they're not envious. You're just insufferable. They flip the narrative not out of insight, but out of necessity. And this explains a pattern that many victims report. The closer you get to peace, the more they seem to provoke chaos. The happier you become, the more they stir drama. Because in their worldview, your peace doesn't represent success, it represents betrayal. Betrayal of their control, betrayal of the imbalance that sustains them. They would rather see you suffer than witness your self-possession, because your self-possession testifies to something they cannot bear, that you do not need them. That's the true source of their envy. Not your things, not your status, but your inner freedom, your ability to walk away, to heal, to live without pretending. That kind of autonomy threatens their entire system of control, and so they will often attempt to destroy it. Not overtly, but through 1,000 tiny acts of sabotage and invalidation. They chip away, hoping you'll shrink back down to the size that feels safe for them. But here's the hard truth, and also the liberating one. Their envy is not your burden to carry. It's not your job to shrink so they can feel tall. It's not your duty to make yourself small so they don't feel inadequate. When you understand that their resentment of your happiness is rooted in their inability to generate their own, you can finally stop personalizing their behavior. You can stop trying to earn what was never truly available. What many people fail to see, and what the narcissist works very hard to conceal, is just how fragile their sense of superiority really is. On the surface, they appear confident, even arrogant. They speak in absolutes, correct others constantly, and present themselves as being above reproach. But underneath that facade lies a profound insecurity, an identity so fragmented that it must be propped up constantly by illusions of dominance. And this is where the paradox reveals itself. The narcissist doesn't actually believe they're better than you. They just need to believe it to survive. That's not an excuse, mind you. It's an explanation. In the narcissist's mind, power equals safety. The illusion of superiority isn't merely an ego boost. It's a psychological survival mechanism. If they were to admit deeply, honestly, that someone else might be wiser, more emotionally balanced, or even morally superior, it would threaten the very scaffolding of their self-concept. That's how brittle it is. They must see you as beneath them, because the alternative is psychological annihilation. And that's why you'll notice they constantly shift the goalposts. You're never quite good enough, never quite smart enough, never quite loyal enough. If you achieve something meaningful, they minimize it. If you grow, they critique. If you set a boundary, they punish. It's a form of psychological gaslighting that keeps you spinning, questioning your own worth, because if you ever stop and see yourself clearly, you'll realize you were never beneath them to begin with. In fact, you were often far more grounded and far more resilient than they ever were. Now, here's the philosophical twist in all of this. The narcissist is, in many ways, a tragic figure. They are people who cannot rest. They are incapable of peace. Every interaction is a potential threat to their dominance. And so they live in a kind of psychological combat zone, always assessing, always competing, always defending their fragile self against the perceived excellence of others. Imagine how exhausting that must be, but also how dangerous. Because when someone builds their identity on the belief that they must always be the best, then your very existence becomes a challenge. And here's the part that shocks people. You don't even have to say anything for this challenge to arise. You just have to be. You show up with emotional clarity, with self-awareness, with authentic joy, and suddenly you're a problem. You're evidence that they are not the center of gravity. And since they can't tolerate that, they'll try to drag you back into orbit, often using tactics so subtle that even you don't realize what's happening until the damage has accumulated. This is where the deeper psychological danger comes in. If you internalize their superiority narrative, if you start believing their framing of you as incompetent, over-emotional, selfish, or disloyal, you slowly erode your own compass. You become reactive instead of reflective. You start walking on eggshells, managing their emotions instead of listening to your own, and eventually your sense of self begins to wither. That's the real cost of staying in proximity to this illusion of superiority. It robs you of the ability to try to see yourself clearly, but the moment you see through it, the moment you realize that their grandiosity is not evidence of strength, but a cover for deep weakness, you begin to reclaim your autonomy. You begin to see that you were never the problem, that your growth, your boundaries, your voice, those weren't threats, they were truths. And it was their inability to sit with those truths that led to the breakdown of the connection. There's a final point to make here, and it's not just psychological, it's moral. It's about your responsibility to your own development. You are not required to shrink so that someone else can feel large. You are not obligated to play small just to protect someone else's fragile ego. There is no virtue in self-betrayal. None. You were not born to be someone's mirror. You were born to be a full person with flaws, yes, but also with strength, insight, and purpose.